always thought I was comfortable being alone in the woods. There was something peaceful about it. The quiet, the open space, the feeling of being away from everything. I'd been camping solo for years, never had a problem. But I made one mistake that trip, and it was enough to make me swear off the woods forever. It started like any other camping trip. I had a long weekend off work and decided to take a break from everything. No phone, no emails, no noise. Just me, my tent, and the trees. I picked a spot deep in the national forest, far from any campgrounds or trails. I liked it that way. No other people, no distractions. Just me and nature. I packed light, like always. A tent, sleeping bag, enough food for a few days, a small stove, a knife, and my flashlight. I didn't bring a gun, I never saw the need. The hike in was perfect. The deeper I got, the quieter the world became. The only sounds were my boots crunching on the ground and the occasional bird in the trees. I found a good spot in a small clearing, surrounded by tall pines. There was a narrow creek nearby, just enough for fresh water. I set up camp, built a fire, and sat back, enjoying the silence. Everything was fine at first. I made some food, watched the fire, and listened to the wind moving through the trees. But then, sometime after dark, something changed. The forest got too quiet. I know that sounds stupid, but if you've spent enough time outdoors, you know what I mean. The woods are never truly silent. There's always something, crickets, owls, the rustling of leaves. But that night, it just stopped. No wind, no animals, nothing. Just dead silence. I felt it then. That strange, uneasy feeling, like I wasn't alone. I told myself I was being stupid. I was miles from anyone, and I hadn't seen a single sign of people the entire hike in. It was just my mind playing tricks on me. Still, I kept the fire going longer than usual, not ready to crawl into my tent just yet. Eventually, exhaustion won. I banked the fire, zipped myself into my sleeping bag, and forced my eyes shut. Then I woke up. I didn't know why at first. My body was just suddenly awake, like something had pulled me out of sleep. My heart was pounding, my breath shallow. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, careful, right outside my tent. I stopped breathing, just lay there, frozen, listening. The steps were soft, almost cautious, moving around my campsite. Not an animal. Too steady, too controlled. I wanted to reach for my knife, but I didn't want to make any noise. I just lay there, heart hammering in my chest, waiting. Then, nothing. The steps stopped. The silence stretched on, long and suffocating. I stayed awake for hours, straining to hear anything, but the footsteps never came back. Eventually, exhaustion won again, and I drifted off. By morning, I almost convinced myself I imagined it. Maybe it was a deer, or maybe I was dreaming. But when I stepped out of my tent, I saw them. Footprints, not mine. They circled my tent, stopping just inches from where my head had been. Bare feet, deep impressions like someone had been standing there for a long time. I felt sick. I packed up fast, shoving everything into my bag without bothering to organize it. I wanted out. Now, I hiked fast, almost running. Every few minutes, I glanced over my shoulder, convinced I would see someone behind me. But the woods were empty, just trees and silence. I didn't stop until I reached my car. I threw my bag in the back, locked the doors, and sat there, catching my breath. Then I saw them. Footprints, bare, leading away from my car. I never camped alone again. I never wanted to go camping that weekend. It wasn't because I hated camping. I actually enjoyed it most of the time. But something about this particular trip felt wrong from the beginning. Maybe it was the fact that it was so last minute. Maybe it was the location, somewhere deep in the national forest, far from any designated camping grounds. Or maybe it was just the way my stomach felt uneasy when we loaded up the car. But I went anyway. It was me, my friend Nick, and his brother Kyle. They had planned this trip all week, and when their fourth guy bailed, they convinced me to take his place. It's just one night, they said. A quick hike in, camp by the river, and hike out the next morning. Seemed simple enough. We left early, driving miles away from civilization. The last hour of the trip was nothing but winding dirt roads, bouncing through potholes, until we reached a clearing where we parked. There were no other cars, no signs of other people, just trees stretching endlessly in every direction. We grabbed our gear and started hiking. The trail wasn't well marked, but Kyle had a GPS, and he swore it would get us there. I kept looking back, trying to memorize landmarks, but everything looked the same. Tall trees, thick underbrush, shadows stretching long across the forest floor. After about 2 hours, we reached the river. It was exactly like Nick had described. A wide stretch of water with a small, flat clearing beside it. The perfect spot to set up camp. We pitched our tents, gathered firewood, and settled in as the sun started to set. Everything seemed fine, peaceful even, the kind of quiet you only get deep in the wilderness, away from traffic and noise. But as the night went on, I started feeling off. I couldn't put my finger on it at first, just a vague sense of unease. Maybe it was the way the trees seemed too tall, too dense, like they were pressing in. Maybe it was the silence, because that was the thing. It was too quiet. I had been camping plenty of times, and the forest was never silent. There were always sounds, crickets, owls, rustling in the underbrush. But tonight there was nothing, just the crackling of our fire and the occasional splash of water from the river. At some point, I turned to Nick and Kyle and noticed they looked uneasy too. Neither of them said anything about it, but they weren't as loud as before. The mood had shifted. By midnight, we decided to turn in. The fire had burned low, and the air had gotten colder. I climbed into my tent, zipped up my sleeping bag, and lay there, staring at the fabric above me, listening. That was when I heard the first snap. A branch breaking, not close but not far either, somewhere out in the trees. I held my breath, straining to listen. Another snap, then nothing. I told myself it was just an animal, a deer maybe, a raccoon, something small, but my gut told me otherwise. I stayed awake for a long time, waiting, listening. Eventually, exhaustion took over and I drifted off. I woke up suddenly. No sound had woken me, no movement, just an overwhelming sense of wrongness. I blinked in the darkness, my breath shallow. Something felt different. Then I realized what it was. The air smelled wrong. It was subtle at first, a faint, sharp scent, something metallic. But the longer I lay there, the stronger it got. It smelled like blood. I sat up, my heart hammering. I unzipped the tent and stuck my head out. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint glow across the campsite. Nick and Kyle's tents were still there, zipped shut. Nothing looked out of place, but the smell was stronger now. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it around. The trees stood still, unmoving. The river was calm. There was nothing out there, and yet the feeling of being watched was unbearable. I wanted to wake Nick and Kyle, but I didn't. I couldn't explain why. Maybe I didn't want to look weak. Maybe I didn't want to scare them. So I just sat there, staring at the trees, waiting for something to move. Nothing did. After what felt like an eternity, I forced myself to lie back down. I kept the flashlight in my hand, barely blinking, listening for anything. At some point, exhaustion won again, and I fell asleep. I woke up to footsteps, not in the distance, right outside my tent. Soft, slow, deliberate. I froze, my whole body rigid. My mind screamed at me to move, to do something, but I couldn't. I just lay there, barely breathing. The footsteps stopped, right beside me. Then, in the silence, I heard breathing. Not my own. Deep, slow. Just outside the thin layer of fabric separating me from whatever was out there. I squeezed my eyes shut, gripping the flashlight so hard my knuckles ached. I stayed like that for what felt like hours. The breathing continued, steady and slow. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped, and the footsteps moved away. I lay there until the sky started to lighten, until I could hear birds chirping again. Only then did I unzip my tent and crawl out. The campsite looked normal. The only thing wrong was the footprints. They were everywhere, circling our tents, leading from the trees and back again. But they weren't ours. They were barefoot, large, too large. I woke Nick and Kyle. Neither of them had heard anything. We packed up in silence. The whole hike back I felt watched, like something was still out there, waiting, hidden just beyond the trees. When we finally reached the car, I turned back one last time. The forest stood still, silent. But I knew, deep down, that we had never been alone. And I knew, without a doubt, that whatever had been out there had let us leave. I never liked deep woods camping. Something about being miles away from civilization, with nothing but trees in every direction, made me uneasy. But my friend Mark had been pushing for this trip for weeks, and I finally caved. He had found a remote camping spot deep in a national forest. No designated trails, no signs, just a patch of land by a river that he swore was untouched. He had seen it on a hiking forum, no official maps, just GPS coordinates someone had shared. A hidden gem, he called it. Took us nearly 5 hours to drive out there. The last hour was on dirt roads so rough I was sure my car would lose a tire. By the time we pulled over at the trailhead, which was really just a break in the trees, the sun was starting to dip. We packed light, bringing only essentials: tents, food, a first aid kit, and a couple of knives. No guns, no flares. I regretted that later. The hike was brutal. The terrain was rough, no clear path, just a general direction we followed on Mark's GPS. The forest was thick, the trees so dense that even in the late afternoon, it felt like dusk. I kept glancing over my shoulder, feeling like we were being watched, but I told myself it was just nerves. By the time we reached the river, it was nearly dark. The spot was beautiful, I'll admit. The water was clear, the sound of the current was soothing, and there was enough flat ground to set up camp. We built a fire, cooked some food, and settled in. But the feeling of unease never left me. The first strange thing happened that night. I woke up in the middle of the night, heart pounding. The fire had burned low, just glowing embers, and everything was silent. No crickets, no rustling leaves, nothing. Then I heard it, a single, slow step, somewhere just beyond the light of the fire. My breath caught in my throat. Another step. It wasn't an animal. I knew that immediately. It was deliberate, careful. I held my breath, straining to hear more, but nothing came. After what felt like forever, I convinced myself it was my imagination and forced myself to go back to sleep. The next morning, I didn't mention it. Maybe I had just dreamed it. Maybe it was nothing. We spent the day fishing, exploring, just trying to enjoy the trip. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Every time we left camp, I felt exposed, like we weren't alone. Then Mark found the campsite. It was about a mile upstream. At first, it looked abandoned, just a clearing with a fire pit. But the more we looked, the worse it got. The fire pit was still warm. There were 2 backpacks, zipped shut, covered in dirt and leaves like they had been sitting there for days. A tent was half collapsed, the fabric torn. And then I saw the knife. It was stuck in a tree, buried deep, like someone had slammed it in hard. We didn't say anything. We just looked at each other. Whoever had been here left in a hurry. Or worse, they never left at all. Mark nudged one of the backpacks with his foot. "Don't," I muttered, but he ignored me. He unzipped it, pulling out a set of clothes, a flashlight, a water bottle. Normal camping gear, but something was off. The water bottle was full. The food was untouched. It was like whoever packed this had planned to stay but never got the chance. Then Mark pulled out a phone. It was dead, but the screen was cracked, like it had been dropped. That was enough for me. "We need to go," I said. Mark hesitated but nodded. We turned back toward camp, walking fast. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something following us. But the woods were still, the silence unnatural. We got back to camp and packed up. The plan was simple: hike back to the car and get the hell out. But then we realized something. The GPS was dead. Mark swore he had charged it, but it wouldn't turn on. My phone had no signal, no compass app, nothing. We had no way to navigate. Still, we started walking, retracing our steps as best we could. But after an hour, The forest looked the same in every direction. No familiar landmarks, no clear path. We were lost, and that's when I heard it again. That same slow step, but this time it wasn't just one. It was several, all around us. Branches cracked, leaves crunched. Whatever was out there wasn't hiding anymore. Mark grabbed my arm, his face pale. "Run," he mouthed. We ran. Branches whipped past, the ground uneven, but we didn't stop. I could hear something behind us, matching our pace, never getting closer but never falling behind. Then Mark tripped. He hit the ground hard, gasping in pain. I grabbed him, trying to pull him up, but then I saw it, a figure in the trees, not moving, just standing there, watching. No details, just a dark shape against the trees. We didn't wait. We ran until my lungs burned, until my legs felt like they would give out. Then somehow we found the road. I don't know how. One second we were lost, the next we broke through the trees and saw my car. We didn't look back. We just jumped in, locked the doors, and tore out of there so fast the tires kicked up gravel. Neither of us spoke for a long time. Only when we were miles away did Mark whisper, "What the hell was that?" I didn't answer, because I didn't want to know. We never reported the campsite, the backpacks, or the phone. Maybe we should have. Maybe someone needed help. But something deep in my gut told me the owners of those things were never meant to leave those woods. And neither were we. We were just lucky enough to escape. I never wanted to go on this trip in the first place. It was my cousin Eric's idea. One last camping trip before summer ended. He'd been talking about it for weeks, saying we needed to do something memorable before life got in the way again. I wasn't against camping, but I liked the kind with marked trails, designated fire pits, and maybe even a ranger station nearby. The place he picked had none of that. It wasn't even an official campground, just a patch of land deep in the woods that his coworker told him about. "There's a lake," he had said. "It'll be perfect." I should have said no. Instead, I found myself driving out with Eric and his two friends, Ryan and Jeff, miles away from any real civilization. We left early in the morning, loaded up with more beer than actual food, and bounced down dirt roads that got worse the farther we went. The last stretch wasn't even a road, just a rough trail that barely looked like anyone had driven on it before. By the time we parked and got out, I already felt uneasy. The place was quiet, too quiet. No distant sounds of traffic, no other campers. Just trees stretching in every direction, thick and endless. We hiked for about an hour before we found a spot near the lake. It was beautiful, I'll admit. The water was still, like a sheet of glass reflecting the sky. There was a small clearing just big enough for our tents, surrounded by dense forest on all sides. No trails, no signs, no way to tell if anyone had ever been here before. We set up camp, gathered wood, and started a fire. The first night was normal. Drinking, laughing, telling stories. The air was cool. The fire crackled, and for a while, I let myself relax. But as the night wore on, that feeling of unease crept back in. I started noticing little things. The forest felt wrong. I couldn't hear anything moving in the trees. No rustling, no insects, nothing. Just dead silence. Every once in a while, I thought I saw something shift in the dark, just beyond the fire's glow. I told myself it was just my imagination, just shadows playing tricks on me. But then Jeff, drunk and half asleep, mumbled something that stuck with me. "It's too quiet out here, man." I didn't sleep well that night. The next morning, we woke up late. The sun was already high, and I was the last to crawl out of my tent. The others were down by the lake, skipping rocks and talking about hiking deeper into the woods. I was against it. I didn't like how lost we already were. I had no idea which way the car was, and I didn't trust Eric to remember. But they called me a buzzkill, so I gave in. We walked for hours. The deeper we went, the worse I felt. The trees seemed closer together, the ground uneven and thick with roots. Every now and then, I thought I heard something behind us, but whenever I turned, there was nothing. Then we found the clearing. At first, it looked like any other empty patch of land, just grass and dirt. But in the center, there was something strange. A single chair. old, wooden, and completely out of place. There were no cabins, no trails, no signs of people. Just that chair, sitting there like someone had put it there on purpose. Ryan joked about it. Jeff laughed. Eric said it was probably left by hunters. But I knew better. Something about it sent a shiver up my spine. It was too clean, no moss, no rot, no sign of wear. Like it hadn't been here long. I wanted to leave, but before I could say anything, Ryan walked up and kicked it over. That was the moment everything changed. The second the chair hit the ground, the wind picked up, sudden and strong, like a storm rolling in fast. The trees groaned, branches swaying, but the sky was still clear. The temperature dropped, and just like the night before, the silence came. That awful, suffocating silence. Then we heard the snap. Not a branch, not an animal. Something big came from the trees behind us, deep in the woods. A slow, deliberate crack, like something stepping down hard. We froze. Another snap, then another. It was coming closer. No one spoke. No one moved. We just stood there, staring into the trees. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw something shift. A shape, tall, still, too still. I wanted to run. I wanted to say something, but my body wouldn't listen. Then, just as fast as it came, the wind stopped. The air went back to that thick, heavy silence. And the chair? It was standing upright again. None of us touched it. None of us saw it move. It was just back, like it had never been knocked over in the first place. That was enough for me. "We need to go," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. No one argued. We turned and walked fast, almost running. The whole time I felt watched. I knew something was there, just out of sight, just waiting. We made it back to camp, grabbed our stuff, and left without a word. The hike back to the car was the worst part. The whole time I could feel it behind us. No footsteps, no sounds, just a presence. Something waiting. The second we saw the car, we ran. We didn't talk the whole ride back. I don't know what we saw. I don't want to know. But I do know one thing. We were never supposed to find that place. And whatever was out there, it didn't want us to leave. I never thought I'd be the kind of person to get scared in the woods. I've always loved camping. Just me, my tent, and the quiet sound of nature. No distractions, no people, just the trees and the wind. It was the one thing that always cleared my mind. But after that trip, I don't think I'll ever camp alone again. I had taken off work for a long weekend, needing a break from the constant noise of the city. I picked a spot deep in the woods, far from any established campsites. It wasn't my first time doing this. I liked the solitude, the sense of being completely alone in nature. I packed light, a tent, some food, a small stove, my knife, a flashlight, and my sleeping bag. I didn't bring my phone. I never did when I went out like this. That was the whole point, to disconnect. The hike in was peaceful. The deeper I got, the quieter the world became. No cars, no people, just the occasional sound of a bird or the rustling of leaves. I walked for hours until I found the perfect spot. A small clearing surrounded by tall pine trees, with a little stream running nearby. The air was cool, the ground was soft, and the only thing I could hear was the wind moving through the branches. It was perfect. I set up my tent, started a small fire, and cooked some food. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the temperature dropped. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and stared into the flames, enjoying the silence. The only sounds were the crackling fire and the occasional hoot of an owl in the distance. Then something changed. It was subtle at first, the kind of thing you might not notice unless you were really paying attention. The wind stopped. The trees, which had been swaying gently all evening, were suddenly still. Even the insects, which had been chirping steadily, went silent. It was like the whole forest had decided to hold its breath. I told myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I wasn't scared, not yet, but I felt uneasy, like I was being watched. I turned slowly, scanning the trees, but there was nothing, just darkness and the flickering light of my fire. I listened, straining my ears, but I didn't hear anything unusual. No footsteps, no breaking branches, just silence. I shook my head and laughed at myself. Paranoid, I muttered. I put more wood on the fire, trying to shake the strange feeling. Eventually, I convinced myself I was overreacting. It was just the isolation, messing with my head. I crawled into my tent, zipped it up, and lay down in my sleeping bag. I woke up to a sound. It wasn't loud, just a faint rustling, like someone shifting their weight on the forest floor. My heart started pounding. I held my breath, straining to hear. The sound came again, closer this time. I reached for my flashlight, my hand shaking slightly, and clicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, but I saw nothing outside my tent, just trees and shadows. I stayed like that for a long time, flashlight in hand, staring out into the dark. My body was tense, waiting for something to move, but nothing did. Finally, I convinced myself it was just an animal. A deer, maybe, or a raccoon. I turned off the flashlight, forced myself to close my eyes, and eventually drifted off. When I woke up, the fire was out. That was strange. I had built it well, and it should have burned for longer. I sat up, rubbing my arms to warm myself. The morning air was freezing. I unzipped my tent and stepped outside. That's when I saw them. Footprints. Not animal tracks. Human footprints. They circled my tent. I felt my stomach drop. My breath came in short, shallow bursts as I stared at them. Bare feet. The prints were deep, like someone had been standing there for a long time, shifting their weight. I looked around wildly, expecting to see someone standing in the trees, watching me. But there was nothing, just the silent forest. My mind raced. Had someone been out here, walking around my tent while I was asleep? Why? I didn't waste time packing up my things properly. I shoved everything into my backpack, tore down my tent, and started walking, fast. I told myself I was being stupid, that maybe I had made the footprints myself somehow, though I knew that wasn't true. I hadn't been barefoot, and I definitely hadn't walked in circles around my own tent in the middle of the night. I walked fast, practically jogging, wanting to put as much distance as possible between me and that campsite. The whole time, I kept looking over my shoulder, convinced I would see someone behind me. I didn't stop until I was nearly back to my car. My legs ached, my lungs burned, but I didn't care. I just needed to get out. When I finally reached the parking area, I threw my bag in the back seat, locked the doors, and sat there, trying to catch my breath. Then, I noticed something. On the ground, near the driver's side door, more footprints. There, leading away from my car. I never camped alone again. It started as a simple idea. A camping trip deep in the woods, away from people, work, and responsibilities. Just fresh air, a campfire, and good company. I wasn't even the one who planned it. That was Brian's idea. He had always been the outdoorsy type, the kind of guy who felt at home in the middle of nowhere. He convinced me and our two other friends, Jake and Tony, to join him. Said he found a perfect spot, deep in the mountains, off any official trails, completely untouched. Looking back, maybe that should have been a red flag. We left early on a Friday morning, driving for hours until the road turned to dirt, then parked the truck at the base of a long, steep trail. The hike in was brutal. Dense trees, thick underbrush, barely any sign that anyone had walked this way before. We carried heavy packs, filled with food, water, and camping gear, trudging uphill for miles. By the time we reached the clearing Brian had picked out, my legs were burning. The spot was nice, I'll admit that. Flat ground, a slow-moving creek nearby, surrounded by towering pines. No sign of civilization in any direction. It felt like we were the only people on Earth. That should have been another red flag. We set up camp quickly, pitching 2 tents near the tree line and starting a fire as the sun dipped low. The air cooled fast, the shadows stretching long across the ground. We ate, drank, and laughed, watching the stars appear above us. Felt peaceful, but that feeling didn't last. I woke up to a sound. It wasn't loud, just a faint rustling outside my tent, like something moving through the underbrush. I stayed still, listening. Probably just an animal, I told myself. A raccoon, maybe a deer. Then I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate, human. I held my breath. The steps moved past my tent, pausing near the fire pit. I could hear faint breathing, slow, controlled. Someone was standing in our camp. I wanted to call out, wake the others, but fear kept me frozen. I lay there, heart pounding, waiting. Eventually, the footsteps moved away, disappearing into the woods. I barely slept after that. In the morning, I stepped outside and saw the footprints. They circled our camp, stopping just outside each tent. Barefoot, large, too large. Brian saw them too, his face tense. Maybe a hunter, he muttered, though he didn't sound convinced. A hunter wouldn't be barefoot. We tried to shake it off, spent the day exploring the woods. The trees were dense, the ground covered in fallen leaves and moss. We found a small waterfall, spent hours fishing, even relaxed a little. But that feeling never fully left me. The sense that we were being watched. And when we got back to camp, things got worse. Something was wrong. We returned just before sunset, tired but in good spirits. Then Tony noticed something. His backpack was open. At first, he thought maybe he left it that way, but then we checked the rest of our stuff. Brian's pack was unzipped too. Jake's sleeping bag had been pulled halfway out of his tent. My flashlight was missing. None of us had been there all day. Something or someone had gone through our gear. A cold feeling settled in my stomach. If someone had been watching us, sneaking around our camp while we were gone, what were they waiting for? Brian wanted to stay. We'll set up watches, he said. Take turns keeping an eye out. I didn't like it, but none of us wanted to hike back in the dark. So we built up the fire, kept our knives close, and settled in for another uneasy night. The footsteps came back. I was awake when I heard them. Slow, measured steps, moving just beyond the firelight. I sat up, gripping my knife. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows against the trees. The footsteps stopped, then shifted direction, circling the camp. Then came the breathing, low, deliberate, just beyond the glow of the fire. I didn't move. The sound lingered for what felt like an eternity, then slowly faded into the woods. I barely breathed until the first light of dawn. When morning came, Tony was gone. His tent was empty, the flap hanging open. His boots were still there, his pack untouched, but he was nowhere to be found. Panic set in fast. We called his name, searched the area, checked the creek, followed the tree line. Nothing. No footprints leading away. No signs of struggle. He was just gone. Jake wanted to stay, to search more, but Brian made the call. We had to get help. We grabbed our gear and left everything else behind, moving fast down the trail. The entire time, I felt eyes on me, like something was following. We reached the truck by late afternoon, drove straight to the nearest town, and called for a search team. They went out the next morning, spent 3 days combing the area. They never found him. No body, no tracks, no sign he had ever been there at all. Just gone. To this day, I don't know what happened to Tony, but I know one thing. Something was out there with us, watching, waiting, and it took him. I should have trusted my gut. I don't consider myself paranoid, but something about this trip felt wrong from the start. Maybe it was the way the forest seemed darker than it should have, or how silent everything became the deeper we went. But I ignored that feeling. The plan was simple. 3 nights deep in Devil's Hollow, an isolated stretch of forest in the mountains. It was a place with no marked trails, no campgrounds, just miles of untouched wilderness. My friend Eric had convinced me and 2 others, Matt and Daniel, to come along. He was an experienced outdoorsman, always looking for remote places to camp, away from crowds and noise. I should have said no. The hike in was brutal. The terrain was uneven, the path overgrown. Our boots sank into soft, damp earth with each step. The further we went, the thicker the trees grew, their gnarled branches twisting above us like skeletal fingers. The air smelled of wet leaves and rotting wood. The silence was the worst part. For the first few miles, there were birds, insects, the usual forest sounds. But the deeper we got, the quieter everything became. By the time we reached the clearing where we planned to set up camp, there was nothing. No birds, no rustling leaves, just dead, suffocating silence. It was unsettling, but I brushed it off. We were miles from civilization. Maybe this part of the forest was just different. We pitched our tents in the clearing near a slow-moving creek. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the campsite. The fire crackled, sending sparks into the air as we cooked our first meal. The food tasted good after the exhausting hike, but that feeling of unease never fully left me. And when night fell, it got worse. I woke up to footsteps, not the quiet scurrying of an animal, but slow, deliberate steps moving through the clearing. I held my breath, heart pounding. My tent flap was zipped shut, but I could hear the sound clearly. Someone or something was walking around the camp. The steps were careful, almost too careful, like they didn't want to be heard. I reached for my knife, gripping it tight. I wanted to unzip the tent, shine my flashlight outside, but I couldn't bring myself to move. I just lay there listening. Then the footsteps stopped. For what felt like an eternity, there was nothing, just silence. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted back into uneasy sleep. The next morning, I stepped out of my tent and froze. There were footprints in the dirt, not ours. They circled the camp, stopping just outside each tent before disappearing into the trees. The prints were deep, the shape unmistakably human. Eric studied them, frowning. "Could be a hunter," he said, though he didn't sound convinced. But a hunter wouldn't sneak up to a campsite in the middle of the night and just stand there. Something wasn't right. We spent the next day exploring the area, trying to shake the unease. The forest stretched for miles, dense and untouched. At one point, we stumbled across something unexpected. A small wooden cabin. It was old, abandoned, the door hanging open. The wood was dark with age, the roof partially caved in. There was no road, no trail leading to it. It was just there, hidden deep in the trees. I didn't want to go inside, but Eric and Matt did. The inside was empty, just a single room, a rusted stove, and a pile of old blankets in the corner. But the walls were covered in deep scratches. Not claw marks, fingernail marks. Something had clawed at the wood in long, desperate streaks. We left quickly after that. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my tent, staring at the fabric above me, listening. Then, around midnight, the footsteps came back. They were closer this time. I held my breath, gripping my knife so hard my hand ached. The steps moved past my tent, stopping near the fire pit. Then, a sound I'll never forget. Breathing. Slow. Shallow. Something was standing just outside my tent, breathing softly, as if listening. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing myself not to make a sound. Minutes passed, maybe an hour, I don't know. But eventually, the breathing stopped, and the footsteps faded into the woods. I didn't sleep after that. At sunrise, we made the decision. We were leaving. We packed up fast, stuffing gear into our bags, not bothering to eat. I felt exposed in the open, like something was watching. The hike back was worse than the hike in. Every snap of a branch made me jump. I kept looking over my shoulder, convinced we were being followed. And then, about 2 miles from the car, we found something that stopped us cold. A fresh footprint in the mud, large, bare, facing the way we had just come. Whoever had been watching us had followed us all the way out. We didn't stop after that. We practically ran the last mile, bursting into the parking lot, throwing our packs into the car. As we pulled onto the road, I looked back one last time. At the edge of the tree line, just barely visible through the branches, stood a figure. Tall, motionless, watching. We never went back. I don't know why I agreed to the trip. Maybe it was the need to get away from work, from the city, from everything. Or maybe it was because my best friend Mark wouldn't shut up about how beautiful Blackwood Forest was in the fall. "It's completely untouched," he'd said. "No tourists, no crowded campgrounds, just nature. He was right about that. The hike in was brutal. The trail was barely a trail at all. Just a narrow, overgrown path winding through dense trees, littered with fallen branches and loose rocks. The air smelled damp and earthy, the ground still muddy from the rain a few days before. There were 4 of us, me, Mark, his cousin Jake, and Jake's friend Tom. We carried heavy packs filled with supplies, tents, food, water filters, everything we'd need for a few nights deep in the woods. As the sun dipped lower, the trees stretched their shadows across the forest floor. The deeper we went, the quieter it got. The usual sounds of the forest, birds, insects, the rustling of small animals, slowly faded. The only noise was our boots crunching on the damp ground and the occasional snap of a branch underfoot. I tried to shake off the unease creeping into my gut. I wasn't new to camping, but something about this place felt wrong. We reached the spot just before sunset, a small clearing near a slow-moving stream, surrounded by towering pines. The place felt isolated, too isolated. We set up camp quickly, pitching our tents near the tree line and starting a fire as the last light drained from the sky. The flames cast flickering shadows across the trunks, stretching them like tall, watching figures. I kept glancing into the woods, expecting to see something move, but there was nothing. That night, I barely slept. The fire had died down, leaving the campsite in near total darkness. I lay in my tent, listening to the night. Then I heard it, a faint rustling in the underbrush. At first, I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon sniffing around for food. But then came the footsteps, slow, deliberate. They circled the camp, stopping every few seconds, as if listening. I held my breath, my heart pounding against my ribs. The footsteps weren't heavy, but they weren't light either. Definitely not an animal. I reached for the flashlight beside me and clicked it on, shining it toward my tent flap. The second the light came on, the footsteps stopped. Silence. I waited, barely breathing. Minutes passed. Nothing. I told myself I imagined it, that I was letting my nerves get to me. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a restless sleep. The next morning, I didn't mention what I heard. We spent the day hiking, exploring the area. The deeper we went into the woods, the more wrong everything felt. The trees grew denser, their trunks twisted and gnarled. The air smelled stagnant, heavy, like decaying leaves and something else I couldn't place. Then we found the cabin. It wasn't marked on any map. Hidden deep in the trees, the old structure was rotting, the wood dark with age and covered in moss. The windows were boarded up, the door slightly ajar. Something about it sent a chill through me. I didn't want to go inside, but Jake and Tom pushed the door open. The inside was empty, just a single room, a rusted-out stove in the corner, a broken table, and a pile of old blankets on the floor. But the walls were covered in scratches. Long, deep grooves, as if someone had clawed at the wood with bare hands. I backed out, my pulse hammering. Something bad happened here. We left fast, hiking back to camp in near silence. That night, the footsteps came back, but this time they were closer. I lay frozen in my sleeping bag, listening as they moved just outside my tent. Then, for the first time, I heard breathing. Slow, steady, right outside. The fabric of my tent shifted slightly, like someone had brushed against it. I gripped my knife, my throat dry. I wanted to scream, to wake the others, but I couldn't move. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the breathing stopped. The footsteps moved away, fading into the trees. I didn't sleep after that. At dawn, I stepped outside my tent and my blood ran cold. Footprints, human footprints. They circled our camp, stopping at each tent before disappearing into the woods. I woke the others. None of us said it, but we all felt it. We weren't alone out here. We packed up fast and started hiking back. The forest felt different now. Every snap of a branch, every rustle of leaves made my skin crawl. Then, about 2 miles from the trailhead, we saw something that made my stomach drop. A single fresh footprint, facing the way we had just come, like someone had been following us, watching us leave. I didn't look back. I don't know who or what was out there. I don't want to know. But I do know one thing. I'm never going back. I don't know why I said yes. Maybe I wanted to prove to myself that I wasn't soft, or maybe it was just to get away from everything for a few days. Either way, I agreed to a weekend camping trip in the middle of nowhere with my brother and his 2 friends. It was late September, just cool enough that a fire would feel good at night, but not cold enough to be miserable. We packed light, tents, food, water, and a few essentials, and set off early in the morning, heading into a forest reserve a few hours outside the city. It wasn't a national park, just a huge stretch of wilderness with barely marked trails. The kind of place where if something went wrong, you were on your own. The hike in was rough. The terrain was steep, the path narrow and covered in roots and loose rocks. We hiked for nearly 5 hours before we reached the spot my brother had picked out. A clearing near a slow-moving creek, surrounded by thick pines. It was perfect, quiet, isolated. Too isolated. By the time the tents were up and the fire was going, the sun was setting, washing the sky in deep reds and oranges. The woods around us turned dark fast. There were no distant city lights, no sounds of passing cars, just trees stretching endlessly in every direction. Something about it felt wrong. I tried to shake the feeling, telling myself it was just the unfamiliar silence. But as the fire crackled and the others laughed and ate, I kept glancing into the woods. I thought I saw something move once, just a shift of darkness among the trees. But when I focused, there was nothing. That night, I barely slept. I heard noises, not just the rustling of leaves or the occasional snap of a branch, but footsteps. Slow, careful footsteps circling our camp. Every time I held my breath and strained to listen, they stopped. I told myself it was an animal. That's all it could be. The next morning, we hiked deeper into the woods, exploring the area. The forest felt different in daylight, less oppressive. We spent hours trekking through the hills, following the creek upstream, and climbing over fallen logs. That's when we saw him, a man, maybe in his 40s, standing on the opposite bank of the creek, half hidden behind a tree. He wasn't dressed for hiking. His clothes were old and dirty, his beard unkempt. He didn't move, didn't call out to us, just watched. We didn't acknowledge him, just turned and walked the other way, moving faster than before. Something about him didn't sit right. There was no gear, no backpack, nothing to suggest he was out here camping or hiking. Just him, standing in the middle of nowhere. When we got back to camp, I checked the ground around our tents. There were footprints, not ours. They circled the camp. That second night, I couldn't sleep at all. Every sound made my skin crawl. I lay in my tent, gripping my flashlight, listening. Then I heard it again. Footsteps, close. They moved slowly, deliberately, just beyond the fire's dying glow. I felt my breath catch in my throat. The footsteps stopped right outside my tent. For what felt like forever, there was nothing. Then, so softly I almost thought I imagined it, I heard breathing, slow, steady. I wanted to call out, to wake the others, but fear kept me frozen. The breathing stayed there for what felt like an eternity. Then the footsteps started again, moving away. I stayed awake until dawn. By morning, I was done. I wanted to leave, but my brother brushed it off. "It's just some guy," he said. "Probably a hunter or a hermit." But I wasn't convinced. As we packed up to hike out, I saw something that made my stomach drop. A pile of small bones, arranged carefully in a circle near the edge of camp. Bones that hadn't been there the day before. I didn't say anything, just shouldered my pack and started walking. The hike back felt different. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves made my skin crawl. I kept looking over my shoulder, convinced we were being followed. Then we saw the cabin. It wasn't on any map. It was old, the wood rotting, the roof sagging. The windows were covered with animal hides, stretched and nailed into place. And the door was open. Inside, the walls were covered in scratches, deep, uneven claw marks. And in the center of the room, a single, freshly severed deer head sat on the floor. We left without a word. The last mile to the car was a blur. We practically ran, every shadow in the trees feeling like it was moving. When we finally reached the car, I felt my entire body unclench. We threw our gear in and peeled out onto the dirt road, not looking back. I don't know who that man was. I don't know what he was doing out there, or if he was the one creeping around our tents. But I know one thing: he didn't want us there, and we should never have gone. I don't know why I ever agreed to that trip. Maybe it was the pressure from my friends, maybe it was the idea of getting away from my routine, or maybe I just wanted to prove to myself that I wasn't as soft as I thought I was. Either way, I found myself deep in the mountains, miles from any town, with nothing but thick pines and the cold October air around me. We had hiked nearly 8 miles into the wilderness before setting up camp. The sun was low, burning the sky orange and pink, and the air smelled of damp earth and pine needles. It was beautiful, but unsettling in a way I couldn't quite put into words. Maybe it was how silent it was. No distant sounds of cars, no voices, not even the chirping of birds, just the wind whispering through the trees. By the time the tent was up and the fire was going, it was getting dark. The 4 of us, me, Dylan, Marcus, and Ryan, sat around the flames, eating cheap instant meals and talking about nothing important. The fire crackled, casting long shadows across the clearing. The woods beyond were pitch black, an endless wall of trees that seemed to swallow everything. I remember staring into that darkness, feeling something strange settle in my gut, a feeling like we weren't alone. I tried to shake it off. It was just the isolation playing tricks on me, right? That first night, I barely slept. I lay in my tent, listening to the wind push through the trees, the occasional rustle of leaves. I told myself it was just the woods settling, but deep down, something felt off. I kept thinking I heard faint footsteps circling our camp, stopping just before I could be sure. But when I unzipped the tent and shone my flashlight outside, there was nothing. The next morning, I told myself I had imagined it. We packed up and hiked deeper into the forest. The terrain got rougher, the trails thinner. It was clear this wasn't a place many people came. The deeper we went, the stronger that weird feeling got. By late afternoon, we found a clearing near a small, slow-moving stream. It was a good spot, flat ground, plenty of wood for a fire. We set up camp again, but something felt different. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. And then we found the cabin. It wasn't on any map. It was old, the wood rotting, the roof partially caved in. The door hung slightly open, swaying with the breeze. No one wanted to go near it, but curiosity won over fear. Marcus was the first to step inside. I followed. It was empty, just a single small room, a broken chair, and a rusted-out stove. But there was something wrong about it. The walls had deep scratches in them, long, uneven claw marks dug into the wood, like someone or something had tried to claw its way out. We left fast. None of us talked about it, but we all felt it. The weight of it. That night, the noises started again. I woke up to movement outside the tent. This time, it wasn't just the wind. I heard breathing. Slow, steady breathing. I held my own breath, straining to hear. The sound was just outside, right by my head. Something was standing inches from my tent. I couldn't see it, couldn't move. I just lay there, heart pounding, waiting for it to go away. And then, it didn't. Instead, I heard a zipper. Someone was unzippering my tent. I reacted instantly, kicking at the fabric, scrambling for my flashlight. The second my light hit the tent wall, the noise stopped. When I ripped open the flap, there was nothing there. The woods were still. The fire had burned down to embers, casting weak, flickering light around the clearing. I scanned the trees, but saw nothing. And yet, that awful feeling didn't leave. I wasn't the only one who heard it. Dylan and Ryan were awake too, pale-faced and silent. None of us said a word. We just sat by the dying fire, waiting for the sky to lighten. By morning, we were ready to leave. None of us admitted it outright, but we all felt it. Something was out there. Something we didn't understand. As we packed, Marcus stopped. He was staring at something in the dirt, just outside our tents. Footprints, but not ours. These prints were deep, larger than any of our boots, and they circled our camp. Worse, they stopped right at our tents. Whatever it was had been standing over us while we slept. We left in a hurry. The hike back felt different. The woods seemed darker, the silence heavier. We moved fast, barely speaking, every snap of a branch making us jump. Then, about 2 miles from the main trailhead, we found something that made my stomach drop. Another footprint, only this one was fresh, and it was facing the way we had just come, like something had been following us. The last mile was a blur. We practically ran, not caring about the weight of our packs, the burning in our legs. We just needed to get out. When we finally saw the parking lot, relief hit me so hard I almost collapsed. We threw our gear into the car and sped off, none of us daring to look back. We never figured out what was out there. Maybe it was some lunatic living off the grid. Maybe it was an animal. But those footprints, they were human. I haven't been camping since.